Everyone, welcome to my channel. So in today's video, I am very excited to share with all of you this gorgeous new blush palette from NARS. So this is the Orgasm on the Beach Cheek Palette, perfect for the summer. So in today's video, I'll be doing swatches, comparison swatches, and a demo of all of these shades. So if you're interested in learning more about this cheek palette, then just stick around. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the packaging for this palette. So it comes in this beautiful summery box, which shows all the shades on the back. And the palette itself comes in this gorgeous pink mirrored packaging that says NARS Orgasm on the front. And then the shade names are listed in the back. Inside you can see you get a really large mirror and then 6 shades. There's a wide variety of different tones, so I think this palette will work across many different skin tones. Also, the shades have an embossment that says NARS on the top and then Orgasm on the bottom. So of course, for those of you who are very familiar with NARS products, the NARS Orgasm blush is one of their most iconic shades. It's kind of like the equivalent of Pat McGrath's Divine Rose or Charlotte Tilbury's Pillow Talk, where NARS has created a ton of products around this Orgasm shade, and this is the latest in that line. So this pinky peachy gold shade down here is the Orgasm shade. Of course, many of you probably already have Orgasm in your collection, in which case this palette is less unique. I personally don't actually have much of a NARS collection, so I'm really excited about this palette as my first NARS palette. So now let's go ahead and swatch all of these shades. So here is the top row. So we have Turtle Bay, Naples, and Mandalay. So here's Turtle Bay swatched, followed by Naples, and then Mandalay Bay. And here's the second row where we have Montezuma, Orgasm, and Zuma. So here's Montezuma, followed by Orgasm, and then lastly here is Zuma. So here we have all 6 shades swatched. And I would say that Naples is actually a little bit deeper than I anticipated, so this could maybe work as a blush. And then Montezuma is a little bit lighter than I anticipated, so this is looking a little bit more like a highlighter on my skin tone. So here we are with Montezuma just on this little apple area of my cheek. And I would say that it's really beautiful, but on my skin, this is probably either a shade that I'll go for as a highlighter or kind of blush topper, or maybe on days if I just really want a glowy cheek and don't want too much pigmentation, because it does really have such a gorgeous golden sheen to it. But it definitely doesn't really give me that blushing look that I would normally be going for. Next up, let's go into the famous NARS Orgasm. So I'm gonna put this kind of next to that shade. All right, so this definitely is giving me a little bit more pigment, I think in part because the pink contrasts more with my skin than the Cantaloupe shade did. So I'm just gonna leave that there because we're trying to really see all of the shades right now. This is not how I would normally apply my blush. There you can see that shade, and I think you can see the differences between these two as well. This one on my skin really just provides a very subtle peachiness, but mostly a golden sheen, whereas here you can definitely see a little bit more of that bright pink flush. The shimmer reflect though is quite similar between these two. They definitely have a really nice golden reflect. Cleaning off my brush, I'm gonna go now into Zuma, which is the much more pigmented shade, and I'm gonna put this more on the outer portion of my cheek. So you can see this definitely provides much more pigmentation than either of the previous ones. It also, I would say, has a lot less shine to it. So on my skin tone, I think this either sheared out would be a really great all over blush, or you can apply it the way I'm doing it now, more in this kind of bracket formation, which can be good if it's a little bit more pigmented. There we go. So I think that's a really pretty red blush shade. So now I'm gonna go in with this Mandalay Bay shade, which almost looks like a bronzer. So I'm gonna try putting that a little bit lower than the other shades to see if it can kind of do sort of a blush bronzer effect. So let's see if we can see that shade. It's a little bit more purpley in hue than I think you would normally want from your bronzer, but it kind of fulfills that purpose. So there it is on this side as a bronzer. I think on the other side, I'm gonna do these in a slightly different order just so we can see these shades a little bit better. But just as a reminder, here we have Montezuma, followed by Orgasm, followed by Zuma, and then Mandalay Bay down here. So taking that Mandalay Bay, I'm gonna go ahead on my other cheek and put it on the outer portion just so we can more clearly see the shade. And this is described as a satin caramel bronze. I really like this Mandalay Bay shade by itself. Like, I think putting this kind of in a bracket formation around the outer portion of the cheeks would really kind of provide some nice lift and bronze. Next up on this side, I'm actually gonna go into Naples, which is described as a metallic rose gold, just to see if this could at all perform as a blush on me. Let's just put this towards the center, and I would say it's kind of similar to Montezuma to me in that it probably is better as a highlighter, but it does actually have a little bit more pigment than Montezuma, as you could see in the swatches. So this could also work as just a very, very glowy blush. I think though, if you use either Montezuma or Naples as a blush and you're of my complexion, be aware that because it is very, very shimmery and you probably need to build it up a little bit to see the pigment, by the time you've built it up, it's definitely going to emphasize any sort of texture that you have on your cheeks. It is a really beautiful shade though. I actually really like this combination of Naples kind of going into Mandalay Bay, because I think Mandalay Bay has a little bit of rosiness underlying the bronze, and so that combined with this sort of taupey rose gold that you see from Naples is actually a really pretty combination. So now, just to help these two cheeks match a little bit more, I'm gonna go into Zuma and just put this all over this middle part, because I think Zuma will help tie both cheeks together a little bit more. And I'll also just take a little bit more of Mandalay Bay to try to use this a bit as a bronzer contour on this side as well. Next up, I'm going in with my Artist Small from Wayne Goss into this Turtle Bay shade, which is a very light shade. So this is definitely gonna be highlighter on both of my cheeks. So let me just sweep that around. I think this shade is probably gonna look a little bit ashy if you're any deeper than me, because it is quite a bright highlight, but it does really melt very nicely into the rest of these products. So here we have all of the shades on my cheeks, and I would say that upon initial impression, I really love how these blushes apply to the skin. So today I have a full base on my skin. So I have the Gucci primer and foundation, the Clinique concealer, and then I've powdered with my Dior Backstage powder, and under the eyes I use my Pat McGrath powder. So at least on top of a powdered base product, this really blends very seamlessly and melts into the skin, even though it's quite a shimmery and pigmented product. I would say that if you are my skin tone or deeper, you'll find that this is roughly a 50-50 highlighter blush palette. So these three over here on my skin tone are a little bit light for blushes, but I think they would work well as highlighters. These three over here provide a really nice amount of pigmentation on my cheeks, and I do find them to be quite buildable. So if you are fairer than me, I think this palette will still work quite well for you, just because even these two deeper shades that look kind of intimidating in pan do apply in relatively light layers, and also they blend out quite nicely. So I think this will work well for folks with lighter skin tones. So now to try these guys out on my lids, I have here my Wayne Goss number 16 brush. And first I'm gonna go into this Zuma shade and try to use this as a bright transition shade. So this is described as a satin rouge and is definitely not that sparkly in tone. So I think this can maybe work kind of like a satin matte. And I've primed my lids today with my Urban Decay primer potion. So this is not blending out the most easily, I would say, but this is, of course, a blush, not an eyeshadow. It is a really gorgeous shade though. Next up, I'm gonna go in with my Wayne Goss number 17 brush into Mandalay Bay and use this to try to deepen up the outer third of the eyes. So this is definitely not providing a lot of depth. So To be expected, I guess, from a blush palette, but just something to note in case you want to use this also as an eyeshadow palette. Next up, I'm going to take some of Orgasm on my GSN 9 brush from Chikuhodo, and this is a shimmery peachy pink shade. So I'm just going to put this all over the rest of my eyelid. That's actually a really pretty eye look. If you are into sort of subtle washes of color, I think this is really pretty. Also, the gold shimmer in Orgasm, I think really lends itself well for an eyeshadow look. Finally, on this side, I'm going into Montezuma and just putting a bit of that in the inner third, just to add a little bit more peachiness there. Now for my other eye, I'm gonna go in first with Mandalay Bay. And in hindsight, I probably should have switched the eyes because I feel like this cheek and this eye are matching, whereas the other cheek and the other eye are matching, but it's okay. This will just be kind of a look that's all over the place because my goal today is really just to try out these products and show you guys how they perform rather than to create a really beautiful, cohesive look. So I think this can hopefully give you a much better impression of how Mandalay Bay looks as a shade. And as you can see, even though it looks really deep in pan, it actually is not super pigmented. So this is already me having blended several layers on top of each other, and this is the level of pigmentation I'm getting. This is a really unique shade though, so it's described as a caramel bronze, but I do feel like I detect a little bit of kind of a cool toned mauviness to it as well. So it's definitely not a bronzer shade. I think they added in a little bit of that mauvey undertone in order for it to look more like a blush. Next, I'm going to take Naples, and this one is the only metallic shade in the palette, so I'm expecting this to give a much higher payoff. So I'm just sweeping this all over the inner 2/3 of my eye. And I would say that even though this is a metallic and Orgasm is a shimmer, at least as eyeshadow, I feel like they provide a somewhat similar effect in terms of level of shine. This one is just ever so slightly shinier. And now with my Sonia G Mini Booster, I'm gonna go into Turtle Bay and use this on the inner corners of both eyes. And on me, Turtle Bay is just a really pretty light champagne shade. Just kind of your everyday highlight shade. I would say though it's borderline pretty white though on me, so if you are deeper than me, this might provide a bit more of a white cast. And now for the lower lash line, I have my Wayne Goss number 20 brush, and I'm gonna first go into Zuma on this side and just sweep this all over the lower lash line. Cleaning my brush off, I'm going into Mandalay Bay and putting this all over the other eye. And then with the tip of my GSN 9, I'm going into this Montezuma shade and putting this on the inner third of this eye. And I'll do the same thing with Naples on the other eye. So here we are with the eyeshadow look done. So I'm gonna go off and do some eyeliner, and then I'll be right back with some comparison swatches. And we're back. So here we have the completed look. And in case you guys were curious what I have on my lips, it's the Guerlain Kiss Kiss in the shade 344. So I figured this really vibrant coral shade would go well with all of these summery blushes. And before we get into my overall thoughts about this palette, I did just want to share with you guys a bunch of comparison swatches. So first off, here are some comparisons with the M Cosmetics blushes. So here we have Venetian Rose, then we have Magic Hour, and then we have Faded Clementine, all from the M Cosmetics Heaven's Veil blush line. And I didn't see a ton of similarities here. So here we have Mandalay Bay, which is definitely a lot more neutral and caramel bronze in tone than any of these. Then we have Zuma, which is a much brighter red than any of these shades. And then the one similarity I saw is that Orgasm and Montezuma blended together, I think would look quite similar to Magic Hour. I thought that Montezuma and Faded Clementine might look a little bit similar, but Montezuma is definitely a lot more peachy rather than orange in tone. In terms of the rest of my blush collection, so here we have the Surratt blush in the shade Rougère, and you can see this is just a lot more berry in tone than any of these shades. In general, this palette runs very warm toned. The Patrick Ta She's Passionate blush looks a little bit similar to Orgasm in terms of the base pigment, but of course this one is matte, whereas this one has a really strong golden shimmer finish. I also have here my Bellini blush from Ofra, which is a matte blush. And the base pigment here looks a little bit similar to Zuma in terms of having that peachiness, but of course the finish is very different. Next we have Nude Venus from Pat McGrath, and also the cheek shade from the Charlotte Tilbury Look in a Palette Glowing Beauty. And I actually noticed these two look quite similar to each other, so I think I just found a dupe for the Pat McGrath blush, but these two are definitely a bit different in tone in comparison to either Montezuma or Orgasm. So I would say whereas Montezuma and Orgasm definitely have a really strong pastel undertone to them, both Nude Venus and the shade in the Charlotte Tilbury Look in a Palette have much more of a deep nude peachiness to them. Also, I swatched a couple of my bronzers next to Mandalay Bay just to see how those would compare. So here we have the Laguna bronzer from NARS, and over here we have the bronzer from the Charlotte Look in a Palette. And you can definitely see based on this comparison that even though Mandalay Bay looks a lot like a bronzer in comparison to the other shades, in practice it has much more of a rose, almost mauve tone to it in comparison to actual bronzers. Next, I did find a couple of shades that were similar to Naples. So this is the highlight in the Charlotte Look in a Palette, which is a bit more golden than Naples. But over here is the Brighton eyeshadow shade, which is the first shade in that Look in a Palette. And I would say that this is quite similar to Naples. It's still a little bit more bronzy in tone, but overall these two are quite similar, not only in terms of the shade, but also in terms of the slightly metallic finish. Last, we have Turtle Bay, and I swatched next to that Champagne Pop from Becca, and I would say that these two are quite similar to each other. Champagne Pop is just a little bit lighter in tone, so it's more of a white gold champagne, whereas Turtle Bay has more of a yellowy, peachy undertone to it. So here's a close-up of the comparison swatches. Fortunately, I don't think any of these are complete dupes for each other. And again, here are the comparisons with the M Cosmetics formulas. And then the last comparison swatch I wanted to show you guys is between Orgasm and Deep Throat. So Deep Throat is on the bottom and is more of a satin finish in comparison to Orgasm, which has much more of a strong shine to it. Orgasm is also a little bit deeper in tone, whereas Deep Throat is a little bit more of a pinky shade. Both of them, though, have a beautiful golden shimmer in them. So now with all of the comparison swatches out of the way, let's get into my overall thoughts and initial impressions from this palette. So on the whole, I would say I am very pleased with and excited about this palette. I really like it, not only for blush, but also I actually really enjoy the eyeshadow look that I created today. So if you guys passed on the quints that Dior came out for their summer collection, but you like that sort of summery satin eyeshadow look, I think this palette can actually achieve a pretty similar look. Like, I feel like the eye looks that I created today remind me a lot of the looks that I saw from folks who reviewed those palettes. These blushes and highlighters aren't necessarily the easiest shades to work on the lids, of course, because this is not primarily an eyeshadow palette. But if you're using this palette for summer travel and you want something that's really simple that can give you some pretty easy and coherent eyeshadow and blush looks, then I think this will be great not only as a blush palette, but also as an eyeshadow palette. In terms of how this palette performs on the cheeks, I would say that overall I think this formula is really lovely if you want a really shimmery blush look. Of course, there are these two satins down here if you want something a little bit more toned down, but definitely the bulk of the palette provides a lot of shine. And so if you're concerned about having texture on your face emphasized, or you just don't really want to have a lot of shine, then I would not recommend this palette. But if you want a really glowy, summery look, then I think this palette is a great way to go. All of the shades meld really nicely on the skin and just give you that beautiful, glowy, flushed look. I would say though, if you are my skin tone and deeper, definitely only pick up this palette if you're really interested in highlighters in addition to blushes, because I would say even though technically Turtle Bay is the main designated highlighter in this palette, both Naples and Montezuma don't have a lot of pigmentation if you're of my skin tone or any deeper. So I think Naples is probably more so of a highlighter on my skin tone, whereas Montezuma is a bit more of a blush topper. That is a little bit unfortunate if you wanted a blush that has this really nice punchy orange cantaloupe tone. So that's the one thing I would say was a little bit disappointing to me about this palette. That said, I would say Mandalay Bay is a surprise favorite for me in this palette. When I first saw this, I thought that Mandalay Bay would primarily be like a bronzer. And then when I saw some other videos of this palette, it looked like it didn't really perform well as a bronzer. And indeed, I would say my experience today using it on this cheek as a bronzer was not that successful. So even though the shade description for this is that it's a caramel bronze, I think it's much better used as a normal blush rather than as a bronzer. This was also my first time trying the iconic Orgasm shade, and I would say that it's really pretty. It's a little bit light and shiny on my skin tone, so I have, again, Orgasm over here, and so I think I would only go for that on days when I really want a pretty blingy blush, but it is really beautiful, and I can understand why a lot of folks really love it. Lastly, I would say Zuma is definitely the blush in this palette that provides the most punch in terms of pigmentation. So a little bit really goes a long way with Zuma. I think it will stand out a lot in comparison to the other shades. But I'm really glad that they included Zuma in this palette, because if you only had the other shades, I don't think you'd be able to create a really high impact look. So overall, I would say that I'm pretty pleased with this palette. I think this is really the perfect palette for summer travel, since you can use it both as a blush palette and as an eyeshadow palette, and the shades are just really approachable and lovely on the skin. Is this the most unique palette ever? Definitely not. I would say even though I wasn't really able to find true dupes in my collection, the overall vibe that this palette gives you is definitely something you can probably achieve with your existing blushes or eyeshadows. So I think the benefit of this palette is really both the luxury experience of how beautiful this compact is, and also just the convenience factor of having all of these shades together. It really encapsulates the summer vibe in a single palette. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!